Mother Earth is an island in the sea of space. No different from an island on a great lake or small lake or even Hawaii, for example. Every island has a limited resource. And we don't perfect our relationship with that island and the resources and the capacity of that island, then we're going to stretch the island to a point where it cannot provide anymore. So, so it's about creating, maintaining a respectful, reciprocal relationship with your environment.
Hi, I'm Tamara, and this is TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Today, I'm speaking with Steven Nitah. He's a leader in Indigenous-led environmental conservation in Canada. So Steven brings expertise and experience from over a decade of work in Indigenous Protected Conserved Areas, or IPCAs. We talk about the significance of IPCAs and the role they play in Canada's future. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Hi, Steven. It's great to see you.
Good to see you too, Tamara.
So I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think this is, a topic that you're the expert, and that's why we're talking to you. But there's a lot of people that don't know about the work that you are doing. So let's start with the basics here. Can you explain what an IPCA is? So the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas. What is that?
Well, those are areas that every Indigenous communities in Canada have, or they all have territories. Whether it's recognized by crown governments or not, we call it traditional territories or contemporary land use areas. The Indigenous Protected and Conserved areas are areas that are declared by Indigenous governments as an area for conservation purposes. Canada wanted to protect 17% of its terrestrial lands and 10% of its oceans, as they committed to, along with 160 some other countries under the Aichi Accord back in 2010. When Trudeau got elected in 2015, he revived Canada's commitment, and they've created what they called Canada's Pathways to Target 1, which was the 17%. As part of that pathways, they wanted to engage with Indigenous nations, governments, and peoples in Canada. So I was appointed, along with 10 other Indigenous folks that are working in conservation. At that point in time, I was leading the negotiations for my nation with Canada through the National Parks Agency and the Government of the Northwest Territories to create a protected area within our territory, the Northwest Territories. So 11 of us Indigenous experts, along with 9 bureaucrats working for the conservation departments of different provincial, federal, and territorial governments, came together, and we embarked on a 1-year endeavor to engage with Indigenous peoples and governments across the country. We had 4 regional gatherings, one in the West Coast, one in the East Coast, one in the North in the Yellowknife, one in South Central Canada and Winnipeg, and gathered people from those regions and pretty much asked the question: Canada's make this commitment to protect 17% of terrestrial lands and 10% of the oceans as a collective effort to protect nature, to give nature its an opportunity to do its thing, to combat climate change. And we just basically asked, what type of relationships would you like to have with crown governments? To use some of your territories to go towards that accounting of 17%.
Are you talking about, so Steven, you mentioned, so we hear about crown land. Crown land is not what we're talking about. Or is it what we're talking about?
We are talking about terrestrial lands in Canada.
Aha.
We are talking about oceans in Canada. So majority of what we're talking about is understood to be crown lands or public lands in northern Canada. So let's see, in those gatherings, we asked a question, and we put a draft report together, brought many of them back together at a national gathering. shared the draft, and then got them back together again to finalize the draft, and we produced a report called We Rise Together with 48 recommendations on how to have better relationships with Indigenous peoples, have better relations between Indigenous peoples and Canadians, and between Crown governments and Indigenous governments to utilize the term Indigenous protected conserved areas towards Canada's accounting. It's coming at a very opportune time as well, because we married this initiative and this Canada's battle was in Target 1 with Canada's reconciliation agenda. The call for action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that most Canadians and corporations and governments have adopted. It's all coming together with some semblance of land back now. Globally, Indigenous people make up 5% of the world's population, but they have 80% of the remaining biodiversity on Earth on their territory, including Canada. So, Indigenous peoples have proven to be the best caretakers, or have demonstrated a healthy relationship with nature. Well, the opportunity in Canada is not only to achieve this 17%, now it's up to 30% based on the new accord that was signed in Montreal last December by 169 countries, all committing to protect 30% of their terrestrial lands and 30% of their oceans if they have it. So those are new targets. It's still part of Canada's pathways to Target 1. And along with Canada's reconciliation agenda, and there's some discussions of land back opportunities. So here's a real good opportunity in Canada to achieve some land back reconciliation through the creation of Indigenous protected and conserved areas that can go towards the accounting of Canada's international commitments, and leave it in the hands of those that have proven to be the best caretakers of it. So that's what the IPCAs are, and basically an IPCA is an area that's declared as a protected or conserved areas by Indigenous people, for Indigenous people, using Indigenous laws where their rights and responsibilities are centered.
Is this a hard path you're walking, or do you feel quite positive about where it's going and the work that you and your team are doing?
Well, when it comes to Indigenous Crown relationships, nothing is easy. It's always difficult. There's whole slews of laws and regulations that has been created over 100 years to support the assimilation policy. Crown lands, from an Indigenous person's perspective, and those of us that have treaties, whether they're historical and numbered treaties, those treaties for the most part are peace and friendship treaties, where we agree to share the lands and share the responsibility. The Indigenous protected and conserved areas provides an opportunity to articulate those types of relationships. For an example, the protected area that we created in the Northwest Territories called Nitah, land of our ancestors, is a 26,380 square kilometer Indigenous protected and conserved areas, where my nation is an equal partner with Parks Canada and the government of the Northwest Territories in the governance, management, and operations of Nitah. We know what the role we each have there and what we can and cannot do. And it describes a healthy relationship. That's an opportunity within IPCs right across the country between provincial, federal, and Indigenous governments and the people who live in those areas. So Canada needs to protect 30%. We haven't achieved 17%, which was a target to be achieved by 2020. So to get to now we have to protect 30%. To get to 30%, we need to protect a quantum of land of roughly 666,000 square kilometers. That's represented 16.2 of the 30% total that will go towards the international accounting. If you want to put that in size perspective, that's a quantum of land roughly the size of Manitoba. So, here is an opportunity where that quantum of land could be Indigenous protected and conserved areas where Indigenous people have the primary responsibility. And in a lot of cases, they could partner with Crown governments in using both Indigenous and public government laws in the creation and operations and management of that area.
And you prefer the term land relationship planning or land use planning, right? That's what you prefer to call it, because it's about a relationship, right? It's about our relationship with nature.
Well, I think that as part of when we're in the heart of COVID, and there is all the positive energy around unity and working together, and we're all saying we need to build back better. Well, climate change is forcing us to look at how do we do better, how to build back better. Language is an important thing. Land use plans is a term we use to describe our relationship with nature. And once what we use, we tend to abuse, kind of thing. So I think we need to understand that Mother Earth is an island in a sea of space. No different from an island on a great lake or small lake or even Hawaii, for example. Every island has a limited resource. And we don't perfect our relationship with that island and the resources and the capacity of that island, then we're going to stretch the island to a point where it cannot provide anymore. So, so it's about creating, maintaining a respectful, reciprocal relationship with your environment.
100%. And do you think that people generally now in 2023 understand, the relationship that Indigenous people have with the land and the knowledge that is there?
Well, Indigenous people and first had great relationship with the Europeans for the first several hundred years. In Canada, anyways, non-Indigenous people learn the language and cultures of Indigenous peoples. There's trade based on equality, but things changed after 1867 when Canada became a country of its own. We started developing policies that tilted the favor towards non-Indigenous peoples. And the policies of assimilation, colonialism was tied directly to capitalism, and capitalism, colonialism are root cause of climate change. Climate change is a social issue. It's not an environmental issue. The environment is paying the price, and we'll pay the price because the environment won't be able to sustain if we keep continuing going down this road. Canada had an assimilation policy like many countries in the world. It's a folly to think that the assimilation policy was only applied to Indigenous people. Indigenous people were the target. And they, got the brunt end of the policy. But Canadians were conditioned and are still being conditioned to be indifferent to what their government is doing to Indigenous peoples. And they're conditioned to feel a certain way towards an Indigenous person without any reason whatsoever. Now, there's a reason why refugees that are fleeing persecution in other parts of the world coming to Canada have no historical relationship with Indigenous peoples, but within 6 months of being here, they start having attitudes. That's part of the systemic policies that's embedded in all our institutions. So there's a need for deconditioning by Canadians. There's a need to understand that they were impacted by policies that very negatively impacted Indigenous people, and how those policies were replicated in other parts of the world that our government, ironically, points out to as being very cruel. Apartheid, for example, it was designed after the reserve systems.
Yeah, this is, I mean, okay, I have more questions, obviously. I want to talk about, addressing some of our climate emergencies. But before we get into that, Steven, we like to thank our guests for being here. And we always ask them to choose a Canadian nonprofit. You chose the Canadian Red Cross Fires Appeal. We will be giving them $500 in your name as a thank you for you being here and sharing, your expert thoughts and ideas and just being the community leader that you are. So as a thank you for that, they will be receiving $500. And that's, I want to talk about the fires that we've been seeing. I'm in BC, and I mean, yeah, it's been intense. But this last summer, we saw, I mean, it's becoming every summer now, and it feels like it's getting worse and worse and worse what we're seeing. And when I see people surprised by it or indifferent about it, I get very worried, because it's we are not doing a very good job here in Canada protecting nature. Can you talk to us a little bit about wildfires and how Indigenous leaders and Indigenous knowledge can help us with that?
Well, I think knowledge comes from values, and values is important. The value of understanding that what we do to nature, we do to ourselves. We take care of nature, nature takes care of us. That's a reciprocal relationship. And understanding that, as an individual, as individuals, Indigenous people inherently understand that we 6-7 generations ahead in what we do. Protecting 30% is not good enough anymore. We need to be able to manage that 30% effectively against climate change. For it to do its 1/3 solution work, we need to help nature get there. So, as I'm saying, protecting 30% is important, but we need to, in a place like Canada, we need to connect that 30% to the international marketplaces, because Canada's commitment of 30% is huge. Our 30% can cover several countries that are making the same commitment of 30%. Their 30% may not exist because of the level of development in some European countries. So, and Canada, in modern days, we are huge country, second largest landmass in the world, and we've got the longest ocean front in the world. So our contributions and sacrifice as a resource development exporting nation as a basis for our economy is humongous. To ask the tax base to pay for the 30% after sacrificing that quantum of land, or roughly 1 million square kilometers, and even larger in quantum in oceans, and then to ask their tax base to pay for the management of that is unreasonable, I'm saying. So places like Canada, Russia, in Australia, where the economy is really on the precipice. We need to create global marketplaces to support that work. So, how do we protect 1 million square kilometers of land? That's our third contribution to the global effort, dependent on our tax base. That's why it's so important that the markets that are being created globally are that our governments at the provincial, territorial, and federal level support the Indigenous governments, provincial governments that are creating these protected and conserved areas, that those areas qualify for the marketplaces. To date, there's over 100 Indigenous protected and conserved areas declared by Indigenous communities and governments from coast to coast to coast.
And Stephen, wildfires, right? They don't care whether an area is protected or not. Wildfires are...
Yeah, wild.
I mean, they'll take down an entire town, right? We've seen, with Lytton, right? And I mean, it's still not rebuilt.
No. So we need to have the resources to plan for and manage these areas against the impacts of climate change. Today is wildfires. We don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. We use in traditional Indigenous wildfire methodologies. You could reduce the fuel load and provide the fires that the ecology needs. Working with provincial, territorial governments through policy, identifying high biodiverse areas or high concentration of carbon sinks that sequester a lot of carbon, should be part of the management of these areas. But, Northwest Territories, our tax base is way smaller than even Canada. With 60% of the population got evacuated. Small businesses were just coming back to life after COVID. So we don't have the tax base to pay for 30%, and our 30% is going to be huge compared to PEI, if you will. PEI can fit into our 30%.
Yes. So, if people, if someone's listening and they're looking at this from a different perspective and they want to help, they want to be a part of the solution, where do you suggest people, do they go to your website? Is that where they can find, ways that they can be a part of the solution? Do they write to their local government? What do you recommend people do when they, because listening to you and having you remind us of our connection to nature and why it's important to, protect nature. Climate change is, it is, everybody I know, is the most important thing. We have nothing if we don't have, Mother Earth, right? We are in trouble, and we're seeing the effects of it. So what do you recommend that people can do to be a part of the solution?
Well, I think doubling down on our commitments to the call to actions as individuals, as governments, as corporations, doubling down on the reconciliation agenda that we're all involved in. Canada has an outline or disproportionately high responsibility in climate change, if you will. We have the nature. We have one of the 4 breathing lungs of the world in our boreal forests. But we also have the raw materials for the technology required to do the the other 2/3 of the solutions to climate change. So, the creation of IPCAs should just be the beginning of relationships towards developing a land relationship plans for the entirety of the country. so that we know which areas we can develop for raw materials for the technology side as well. And and that we bring Indigenous values into that land relationship plan so that we can fulfill our responsibility to the seventh generation ahead. I think we have that opportunity in Canada. We could do better in Canada. We follow this road where we're collectively in, even through the hard times of financial impacts. I think we would do the world a service, and we would become a better place to live in Canada.
Fantastic. I totally agree, Steven. I can't thank you enough for this. I just want to remind everyone that the website where you can find out more information about Indigenous protected conserved areas is conservation-reconciliation.ca. Steven, I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you so, so much.
Yes, and another website I'd like to what is natureforjustice.org.
Natureforjustice.org.
Yes.
Perfect.
Nature for Justice is a social justice NGO based in the United States, but it's global. It's Neil. I'm the managing director of it in Canada. And
Perfect. I'll bookmark it right now. Thanks for listening to another episode of TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Be sure to subscribe so you can join us every Tuesday for another conversation. You can also check out our website, telus.com/podcast, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at TELUS Talks. To learn more about how Indigenous communities are leading the way and driving positive change in their communities, you can sign up to receive the TELUS Indigenous Reconciliation and Connectivity Report. The report launches on November 23rd and dives into TELUS's commitment to closing the digital divide in Indigenous communities. Visit the TELUS website to sign up and receive more information.